welcome to Select Arcane. I do paint a lot for myself, but if you've noticed, I really stick to the tiny models like micros and minis. I'm far too scared to touch my traditionals, especially since they're so expensive. So, when I do get my traditionals painted, it's usually a commission by somebody else. I have a lot of beautiful models in my collection, and they're painted by some of the most esteemed artists in the hobby. Sometimes before they leave, I do have to get them ready myself though. If I have enough time, I'll prep my own model before sending it. And that's the case here. I have this absolutely beautiful Kipling sculpted by Morgan Kilburn, who was produced in 2011. I believe Morgan actually casted him herself at the time, and back then, resin production was still a little bit quirky. It was almost impossible to get a perfect cast, unlike now where you can get a almost ready-to-go resin. Back then, those resins required a lot of prep work. And that holds true for this little Kipling here. First, I look him over and see what the damage is. He has a ton of holes caused by air bubbles during casting. But not to fear, this is easily fixable and not as intimidating as you might think. I'm going to be using my handy dandy Apoxie Sculpt to start. It's a two-part epoxy, and when mixed together it creates a chemical reaction, and in 2 hours you will have a hard as rock clay that you can carve and sand as needed. I take equal parts A and B, mix them together very thoroughly, and then apply them to the holes. I'm just going really rough and really general, and I smooth it down with a bit of water. I do recommend using rubber gloves in this case because the chemical reaction can irritate skin. Better safe than sorry. You can't expect your finish work artist to actually do an entire renovation on a resin, especially something as rough as an eberol resin. And this guy almost fits the bill for an eberol, so he needs a lot of help. Because of his air bubble issue, poor Kipling has lost some detail in some hard to reach areas. So I'm using my color shaper tool to push the epoxy right in and to also sculpt the area. You can get these color shapers off of Amazon, but I bought these specific ones from a sculpting store. Like I said, I'm using water here to help move the epoxy around, but I also like using rubbing alcohol, which dries quicker and doesn't get away from me as quickly. Using a pin or anything really sharp, I also poke around the model to find any air bubbles that have not popped yet. These are areas that might look darker, and you can poke and cave in that resin. There's no point of keeping it there when it's just going to cause a problem later on if your model tips over. I just clear out the area as such and add epoxy. I should point out that if you do not choose to prep your resin ahead of time, or any model for that matter, your finish work may not stick, may not be durable, or you'll just see a ton of flaws in your model at the end of the day. So I highly recommend that you follow these steps to prep. As you can see, poor Kipling had a lot of problems with these hidden air bubbles, but it is important to find them all, pop them all, and fill them all. I also looked for any seams or gaps in the resin that required some heavy-duty care. I filled these areas in as much as possible using my color shaper tool to push the epoxy in and just kind of eyeballed it. There's going to be a lot of work coming up, so I'm just filling in these big gap areas that I can see with my naked eye. At this point, I don't think I see any more huge holes, so I'm just going to wait about 2 hours to let the epoxy cure. And then I'm going to bring out the big guns. I'm bringing out the diamond coated file that I got from Amazon. And as you can see here, this is my old one and this is a relatively newer one, and you can see the difference between the teeth. This older one definitely needs to be replaced. This is sanding number 1. The file takes down anything big and hard to sand down. It's going to leave a few scratches, but that's okay at this point. I file down the resin, also some of the new modifications that I've made. I'm being kind of rough because I'm not going to take away any detail because the resin itself is pretty durable. As I'm filing, I poke more air bubbles and scrape out any extra resin as required, like flash or seams. With these older resins, you can find a lot of these things in the chest, legs, and tail area. In this case, he also has a lot on his face, so I really just file his whole body as much as I can. It's a very tedious process, and I am binge watching anime to make the time pass faster. This guy is going to take forever, and this is why a lot of finish work artists do not prep resins to this extent. It's just a lot of work. No joke, that actually took hours. And I finished the first season of my anime already. For this next step, I'm gonna try something new. I have these really cool Carbide scrapers that I got for Christmas one year. I've never used them because my models have always been too small to use them with, but in this case, I think it'll be perfect. They're so pretty, and Kelly Seeley always makes them a nice pretty rainbow color. These work great for etching original finish horses like Briars, or for prepping. I have absolutely no idea how to use these things, but I'm going to randomly choose the orange tube and hope for the best. I screw the top in and go to town on the hooves, carving them out. There's a lot of resin overlap, and I just need to carve that out to make the hooves a lot cleaner and to actually find the frog. Be careful because these Carbide scrapers are so sharp, I can't believe it. And they work like crazy. They've gotten a lot of positive reviews in the hobby community, and I can really see why. Once Kipling is how I want him to be, or at least how I think I want him to be, it's time for a bath. I really can't see any more issues to the naked eye, and I know that there's going to be a lot more to come. Oh, and you think we were done with sanding? We are never done with sanding. I take him over to the sink and use anti-grease dish soap on him, and I'm specifically using Sunlight brand. I give him a really good washing with a toothbrush designated for my models, and I really, really scrub him. There's a lot of dust and dirt and debris on him, and I want to make sure he's really clean for the next part. Washing and scrubbing him will also take off any mold release that was added during the resin making process. Keeping it on can give the finish work issues later down the line, and that includes paint not even sticking to the model to begin with. As I leave him to dry on a paper towel, I do a little bit of vacuuming of my desk because I need him clean for the next steps. Wow, even after just a bath with soap, he's already looking so much cleaner and whiter. I got him secondhand, but who knows how many owners he's had since being cast. Who knows how long he hasn't been washed for. Ew. Anyways, moving on to the next step, I'm doing layer 2 of Apoxie Sculpt. Now that he's clean, I can actually see some areas that I've missed and will be too big to sand or fill with spot putty. Like before, I use parts A and B, mix them together, and apply generously to the base. I use water to smooth it out and use my color shaper to push it around. There's also this really tricky spot between his back legs, and I fill that as well. I think you already know the drill. 2 hours for the epoxy to cure, and then we sand, sand, sand. If you've watched my previous videos, you'd know that by now I would probably have thrown a layer of primer on to see any mistakes I've made. Well, in this case, because he's going to an artist, I don't want to put my own primer in case there's a chemical reaction with their paint choices. I don't know what the artist is going to use as paint, and I don't know what they prefer as primer, so I'm just going to completely not do that. It's a little harder for me to figure out exactly where I need to prep, but I'll do my best so that the artist has minimal work to do before painting. But if you were curious, if I was to prime him, I would be priming him in Duplicolor Sandable Primer. After a few more hours of sanding with a file, he gets another quick bath with soap and water, and it's back to the drying shelf. This next step is honestly my least favorite part. First, I'm going to put my filtration mask on, turn up my overhead fan, and open a window. This stuff is nasty. It stinks and it will give you a huge migraine unless you protect yourself. This is Bondo glazing and spot putty. It's an automobile product used for minor damage and scrapes of your car, but it also fills your pinholes in absolutely beautifully. Because I haven't already primed Kipling, I can't see any of the pinholes, so I'm just going to slather him in this stuff. Bondo dries in about 30 seconds, so I add some to my gloved finger and completely cover him. I go back and forth, adding more, applying it, and I try to smooth it as cleanly as possible all over his body. Of course, he doesn't look very good. I cover him from head to toe and smooth over with my finger until the putty is dry. And once he looks the worst he's ever looked during this entire video, I bring out my 180 grit sanding sponge. This is a very fine sandpaper, and I'm going to go over his entire body and shave off all of this Bondo. It seems a little counterproductive, but trust me, the end result is completely worth it. See these little dots and scrapes all over his body in red? Those are the pinholes and the cuts made by the file. You couldn't see them at first, but if you had added primer, they would have showed up right away. Would have been like a neon sign. Once I've sanded as much as possible and used all of my sanding sponge, I take him over to the sink and clean him up with soap and water again, but I'm also going to scrub him with baking soda. It's kind of like a wet sandpaper technique, and I scrub very hard into his crevices like his mane and tail to get out any of the loose putty and smooth him out. And again, he does not look pretty, but he is completely smooth to the touch, and all of his pinholes are officially filled. And this is it. I mentioned that I'm not going to be priming him for the artist's benefit, and I know he looks rough, but honestly, if you spray him with primer, he'll be all ready for painting. Thanks for watching. I hope somebody found this really useful for one of their own resins. Maybe one day I'll make one about Breyer horses as well. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can find me on Instagram @SelectArcane and on Facebook by the same name. Thanks for watching. Bye!